All right. Well, thank you for everyone who's joining us. We'll go ahead and get started. First of all, welcome to today's webinar. We're excited to have everyone with us and excited to be here with you. I'm delighted to start talking about some of the cool things we can do with fast reactors as a continuation of our webinar we had back in June. The idea here is we're bringing together different experts and leaders and folks working in technologies to help deploy fast reactors and their benefits and the associated technologies with them, sort of in a series of different webinars that are going to cover different angles. This is the second one we've had that'll talk about what fast reactors can do and how that ties in with the fuel cycle. And it's really intended to be a pretty high level discussion that gets into the weeds in fun areas, but talks about what fast reactors as a whole can do, not just one specific type or the other. And then we'll actually have follow-on webinars that hit on some of those more specifics. We'll be inviting folks from different technology spaces with different expertise to talk about more specific applications and benefits you can do with those and follow-on ones. So obviously stay tuned because there'll be many more in this area as well as other technology setups. So with that, I'm Jacob DeWitte. I'm CEO and co-founder at Oklo, and chair of the Fast Reactor Working Group. And I'm delighted to have Bob Hill with me today. And so, Bob, do you mind doing a quick introduction of yourself, and then I'll go ahead and get this started with some questions and conversation.
Yes, Jake. My name is Bob Hill. I'm a program leader at Argonne National Laboratory. I've been working on fast reactor research and development at Argonne for the past 30 plus years. And I'm currently the National Technical Director for the DOE Fast Reactor Research and Development Program.
Excellent. So, the intent of today is to be very much a fireside chat. So Bob and I are going to be talking with each other pretty dynamically. As you guys ask questions, ask them live time. We're going to be incorporating those into the conversation that we have and using those to inform even the questions we ask each other. So first and foremost, I'll go ahead and kick it off, Bob. Why is it and how is it that fast reactors can do all of the really cool things that they can do with the fuel cycle in terms of being able to actually tap into and unlock the tremendous energy potential in the uranium and thorium that we pull out of the ground?
So the benefits and the possibilities in fast reactors were really identified at the conception of nuclear reactors and nuclear energy. Fermi recognized very quickly that a fast neutron spectrum would be required to realize the full potential of nuclear energy and the content of energy in the actinides. This that he realized is because of the physics and the favorable neutron balance that you have in a fast neutron spectrum compared to a thermal neutron spectrum. This favorable neutron balance allows the conversion of fertile actinides into fissile isotopes, and then those fissile isotopes can be fissioned to produce energy. So it gives you access to all of the actinides eventually to be converted into energy, as opposed to when you need to enrich for a system and you're only able to get partial conversion of the actinides into energy. This idea and the development of fast reactor technology was the focus of the research and development programs, both in the United States and abroad, very early in the nuclear era. In the US, we had EBR-1 in the 1950s, then EBR-2 up and operating in the 1960s. We had a fuel cycle demonstration in EBR-2 that we'll probably talk about later in this discussion. And there were also fuel cycle demonstrations in the Russian BN-350 reactor and the French Phoenix reactor. So not just the idea of fast spectrum reactors, but actually them tied into and demonstrating in fuel cycles was a focus very early in the nuclear era of the R&D programs and was demonstrated within the systems. Today, there's a lot of improved technology that allows us to extend both the lifetime in the reactor of the fuels and to enable efficient recycle. So there's a lot of exciting benefits today and ways to do it that are beyond some of these early demonstrations.
Awesome. I think that is, part of the motivation for why a number of technology developers and reactor designers are pursuing different approaches here. And I think one of the cool things is you can actually take advantage of the benefits of the fast spectrum in a number of different ways, which you indicated. So I guess the next question that kind of stems from that is really how how are fast reactors able to realize that potential of being able to consume effectively all the actinides and convert them into energy? How does that actually get done? Because obviously there's some limitations. You can't just put fuel in a reactor and it burns all the way through. You have to maintain the minimum amount to maintain criticality. So how is that done? What are the different approaches being taken to really dive deep into the energy content in the fuel?
Right. So for most fast reactor systems, and the ones that have been demonstrated to date, are relying on solid fuels. And in the solid fuel systems, typically the lifetime in the reactor has been limited for fast reactors by neutron radiation damage. So typically you're nowhere near where you need to bring the fuel out in order to replenish the fissile material, but you're at a point where you need to bring the fuel out in order to reconstitute it, because structurally the materials are not able to withstand the radiation field longer. So this has been the limitation up to now in fast reactor technologies, and they've been demonstrated today up to about 20% burn-up levels for a single pass within the reactor. But in some of the early demonstrations, there were much, much lower burnups that they were able to get to back there. So there's been a lot of movement in that, and there are a lot of concepts out there that are even trying to push well beyond the 20% burnups that we have demonstrated today. So you really have two different facets, Jake. You have going for as far as you can burn up the fuel when it's in the reactor and trying to extend it. Now, fast reactors have very favorable performance here, because you can usually balance by your uranium loading the production of new fissile material with the destruction rate of that fissile material. And you don't usually need to stop the reactor in order to introduce new fissile material. So you can try to push it as far as you can during a single recycle. And then you get into the recycle technologies, which are how I would reconstitute the fuel in order to burn it up farther than I was able to get through in a single reactor pass. So on both of those, there's been a lot of technology movement and improvement since the early demonstrations of fast reactor recycle.
So let's dive into that in two angles. So one you discussed is having it run for a long time, concept that sometimes is referred to as breed and burn. I guess one question that follows from that is, how is that in practice achieved, and kind of what's the general benefit of that? And then I think the question that I want to go to after that is getting into the reconstitution part, like the actual recycling part, and kind of talk about where that's going. So let's start first though with the breed and burn side. So, obviously that has a potential to unlock more energy than if you just do, I would say, like compared to kind of a conventional or a once through and a more, I would say, traditional or conventional setup for a thermal spectrum reactor. How much more energy can you get, and how does that basically work in principle?
Okay, just to calibrate, Jake, first, let me just discuss briefly what we're able to get to in today's fuel cycle that we're doing in light water reactors. So for light water reactors, for every ton of fuel that you're making for the reactor, you have about 5 or 6 tons of depleted uranium, because you have to enrich that uranium in order to make the fuel for the reactor. And then that 1 ton that goes into the reactor, you run to roughly, for some of the modern designs, up to 5% burnup. So you get 5% of destruction of about 6 metric tons. So it's less than 1% of the uranium utilization that you're getting in the current fuel cycle that we have for LWRs. Now, for fast reactors that are going to do a breed and burn, once you're up and going and once you have your initial inventory of fuel, you're really limited just by how far you can get on the fuel form itself. And again, traditionally, there were very low burnup levels for fast reactor fuel forms, but now both for solid fuel forms in either oxide or metal alloy, we've demonstrated up to 20% burnup. So you should be able to get to about 20% fuel utilization when you're in a running system with breed and burn concepts and able to do them. And I know there's a lot of work going on in some companies looking at materials that will get you well beyond that 20%. That 20% was able to be achieved by going to some better steel alloys, but again, these are still steel alloys that are about 20 years, 30 years old. So you probably can do even better today to get to even higher burnups. But for the breed and burn, you're really limited by how far can I go in the burnup in a single pass, because you're not going to take, so you could start from natural uranium and then you could go for this one pass, and then you would be disposing of it in a pure breed and burn concept where you weren't going to do recycle. And then if you were going to do recycle, you would still be able to go farther in a single pass if you had these better materials that could get you to 20% or higher burnup. But then you would take that 80% of actinides remaining and you would recycle it and try to get more energy out of it. And so for the recycle fuel cycles, you're really only limited on how much energy you can get out of them by what are your losses when you do the recycle technology. So if you have high losses, you're going to still have a significant loss of the eventual energy potential. But if you have low losses, you can even get, in many of the international studies, up to 90% or higher energy utilization from these recycle fuel cycles.
And that's completely transformative. So I guess one of the questions that dives a little deeper into what you said for baselining, how does that then compare? You gave a good example for what LWRs can do. What about for other sort of the other approach from advanced reactors that use effectively fuel forms, but are still in the thermal spectrum? So going to high enrichment, so high assay, low enriched uranium, as it's commonly called. So, you know, up above 5, but less than 20%. How does that compare for those kind of designs? Because granted, they can hit higher burnups, but how does that compare for their overall uranium utilization?
Yeah, they can hit higher burnups, but what we've seen in general is because you have to go to higher enrichment, you have more depleted uranium in order to get to that initial fuel. And typically they still are around 1% energy utilization as a whole. You have much better utilization of the fuel that goes into the reactor, but you have much more depleted uranium if you're starting with high assay LEU.
Interesting. Okay. So I guess, you know, the one conversation that then is I think the natural extension is obviously the exciting potential here, the capabilities are here. You said they've been demonstrated. Can you talk a little bit more about what the experience has been to date, dating all the way back to even EBR1 days and kind of going forward at a high level where we've actually been able to show that these things work and show some of the technological progression that's occurred since then, before we dive into some of the more modern approaches that you mentioned earlier?
Okay. So EBR1, which was the 1950s, which was, you know, just about a decade after you have the first demonstration that you could even have a sustaining chain reaction. The purpose in EBR1 was to demonstrate the capability to breed, or in this case, what it was to demonstrate the capability to operate a system and have more fissile material at the end than you had at the beginning. So that's what they meant by breed. So what they did in EBR1 was by looking at the reaction rates within the different regions of the reactor, they were able to show that the production rate of fissile material in that very small reactor was a bit larger than the destruction rate which you had through the fission of that material within the system. So EBR1 was a demonstration of the potential to have this favorable balance where you're able to conserve or slightly increase the fissile material content. And now in EBR2, then they wanted to go beyond that and actually demonstrate the ability to generate fuel material and then pull it out of the reactor and put it back into the reactor. So they wanted to demonstrate recycle in EBR2. In its first decade of operation, actually between the years 1964 and 1969, EBR2 had 30,000 pins that were recycled, that were taken out of the reactor. They were treated by a very simple reprocessing, and they were put back into the reactor and irradiated back in the reactor. So this was showing the ability to recycle the materials, not just to have the favorable balance on the fissile material itself. That EBR2 initial demonstration was to very low burnups. The fuel was not going to the 10 to 20% that I talked about, but actually going to less than 1% burnup in the initial EBR2 demonstration. And that was because of some limitations on the early fuel forms where they weren't able to get to the burnups that they were able to get to with the research that was done 20 years later. So for very low burnup, they demonstrated the ability to recycle within the reactor. And as I said, similar things were done with oxide fuel forms in BN350. And then by the French did this in Phoenix for small batches to show the ability to reconstitute the material and put it back in the reactor and burn it a second time through in the reactor. So that's sort of the history of what was done early on. And then there's been a lot of work on the fuel forms since then, getting them to much higher burnups, but there has not been a lot of demonstration of the fuel cycle since some of those early demonstrations.
So with those demonstrations, can you talk a little bit about some of the technologies that were employed there? And that helps us then move the conversation into like really I think the crux of some of what's driving a lot of interesting innovation now, which is how the technology has progressed. So what was kind of done dating back to, kind of the melt refine models way back in the past, all the way
Yep.
through some of the other approaches that were taken?
So in EBR2, in the original demonstration, again, they were going to less than 1% burnups in the fuel. So they didn't have a lot of fission products, and they didn't need to remove much stuff. They really just needed to reconstitute it into a new fuel form, because they'd had the fuel swell and they were starting to push on the cladding. They've done a better fuel design since then, but that was really their limitation. So they did a melt refine type of process, where they basically melted the fuel, got rid of some of the volatile fission products, kept all the actinides, and cast it back into a new fuel form with very little makeup needed. Again, because they were only to 1% burnup, they didn't need very much makeup at all. And then constituted it into a new fuel slug, put that back in a new cladding, and put it back into the reactor. So that was what they did in EBR2. Very simple, because it was very low burnup. Now, if you had the fuel forms that we have today that go to 20% burnup, you have a lot more fission products involved in there. You need to use a better process that can remove those fission products before you put it back in the reactor, because otherwise you're going to get a very significant buildup, and eventually your fuel would become more fission products and less actinides, and become a very hard fuel to operate a reactor on.
So on that, what's going on there? So how do we do that? I mean, and especially with, one of the things that I think, has been of high interest, that I think has motivated folks to be excited about fast reactor technologies, is looking back to the integral fast reactor program and looking at how advances in recycling coupled with the reactor and the fuel technology can enable a more, I would say, synergistic and what I believe to be pretty strong economic coupling as well. So what's going on in that space? In other words, what is advanced recycling to look like, to be able to deal with fuels at these high burnups, deal with more efficient, I'd say, reconstitution and separation of the useful materials?
So based on EBR2 experience, a lot of the research in the United States has focused on advanced versions of electrochemical processing technology. These are particularly applicable to metal alloy fuel forms, as were operated in the EBR2 reactor. Easy to get the fuel into those. What we've done is develop much better processes and much better configurations for that process, on the ability to recover the actinides. So you're trying to recover the uranium and all the above uranium, the transuranium elements also within the fuel, in order to recycle into the reactor. And you're trying to limit the amount of fission products that are that go back into the reactor. Excuse me. So there's been a lot of work then looking at better, more efficient configurations for the electrochemical processing, as well as how to get the loss rates down for that, and as how to get the carryover of the fission products into that down to lower levels. I think that'll probably be a topic of a later webinar to go into the details of that technology. But in the US fast reactor technology, that has been a lot of the focus. There's been a lot of work in the international context on advanced aqueous processing methods. Those use modifications to the Purex type of technology, which is currently being done in France and Russia. And typically some of those modifications are ways to not have a pure plutonium stream and to recycle all of the transuranics together. And those are also being worked on from the international context. So there's a lot of options for the different advanced separations technologies.
So what do you think, and you're right, this is going to be a good conversation to dive a little deeper in the technology side on that in the next upcoming webinar set. But what do you think is going on now to make this more attractive as an approach? And I guess the other question is, how are people, how is this sort of, I guess, changing in the paradigm of the renewed interest, I should say, maybe not even renewed, but I should say new interest altogether in advanced reactors, especially as they can work on, mitigating climate change as we move towards clean energy solutions and looking at a globally scalable system. How do you feel like things are evolving right now? What do you think is sort of, in the recent years, has changed both on the R&D side, but also, as you see the landscape, the actual market pull side?
Yeah, so I saw some questions in the questions and answers about, why wasn't this deployed, and why hasn't it been done? And I'll take a little bit of a step back to try to deal with some of those. When Fermi concluded early on, we better do fast reactors and we better do them quickly. EBR-1 was 1950s, actually. Actually, it was up and running before the shipping port, which was the LWR demonstration was up and running. The expectation at that time was you're going to need a lot of nuclear power, and the uranium resources were going to be very limited. So it was a high demand, limited supply, and that was going to drive it. And I really do think today we haven't seen nuclear take off as quickly as they expected back in the 1950s and 1960s. But it has grown. I mean, it still is about 15% of electricity production worldwide, and it is sustained there. But a lot of the clean energy discussion looks at increases of that, and that being much more than 15% in the future, and us having much more electricity needs as the population of the planet expands. So in that context is really where you need fuel cycles and you need fast reactor systems in the context of lots of nuclear. If it's a limited nuclear, we can use some of the resources we have. We can be inefficient on the fuel cycle and not have to pay the penalties for that. But if we're going to have a future that has a lot of nuclear power, then that's going to become much more important. So I think that's one of the things that's driven it, Jake, is with the clean energy aspect of this, we're looking at an expansion and both a continuation and an expansion of nuclear power. And the more power you have, the more important it becomes to efficiently use your fuel resources and not to just go with a once-through fuel cycle where you're being very inefficient with the fuel materials themselves. The other aspects then, we talked a little bit about the breed burn. The ability to go to much higher burnups in a single cycle also drives you to go to fast spectrum systems. They're very well designed for these very long lifetimes, having cores that can go a very long time before being shut down and refueled. And that's important for many of the concepts and many of the different markets that are being looked at by the different advanced reactor vendors today. So I think those are two aspects. It's expanded nuclear and the ability with new technology to overcome, to do new things that you couldn't do before and to overcome some of the challenges from the past.
So I think that brings up an interesting point, which is, I think, the economics part of this, which drives so much. I think as we look at the story, one thing you illuminated is at kind of the scale and what's driving, I think, looking at different technological benefits as you look at broader scale. And I think one of the key enablers that we're seeing occur in terms of what you can do with advanced reactors and what their potential is complemented by their economic upside, right? Not only is their ability to produce clean power reliably and in a dispatchable fashion very significant to looking at clean grids of the future, but also economically speaking. We see that when you just look at the life cycle, material needs for any power source, by any fuel type, to make a single, unit of energy they make. So let's just pick a gigawatt hour as an example. Nuclear is dwarfed by everything else. So it should economically have the potential to be cheaper than everything else. And I think one of the exciting things going on now is we're starting to really revisit the paradigm about why costs have gone to where they have gone with nuclear, which I would contend in many cases is really due to artificial costs. So as you look at that context and you look at what advanced reactors can do to help reduce those, one of the really attractive things about fast reactors is their ability to drive economic, approaches and design, given their ability to, one, tap into fuel more efficiently, but two, also on the capital side. And I think this is a really important paradigm shift that's occurring, which is one thing you can do with these fast reactor designs, and you sort of change the economic paradigm for light water systems, is you can start to look at how you can take advantage of technologies, design approaches, the inherent safety capabilities of fast reactors, the high performing cooling capabilities of them, as well as the high performance fuel utilization capabilities of them, and all together come up with systems that ultimately have lower capital costs. And one of the things with advanced reactors is they're also pushing that angle to be able to realize that, but then oftentimes going to fuel that is usually enriched above 5% uranium. And that opens a whole different economic aspect to the recycling side, Bob, like you were hitting on. And I think this is a really important piece because one of the more interesting things came from Argonne in recent years was a report looking at effectively a design study of a pyroprocessing facility at a pilot scale. And right now there's a lot of discussion about high assay low enriched uranium, which is very important for looking at how we get reactors out the door and built for advanced reactors especially. But perhaps one of the most interesting things is looking at that facility. The economics suggest you can actually recover transuranic fuel material more cheaply than it is to produce fresh HALEU in many cases, especially at that scale in that facility, which all of a sudden starts to change the whole economic side where the fuel becomes cheaper. Now that's obviously a shift from the conventional paradigm where you're dealing with LWRs using fuel enriched, up to just under 5%, and doing high purity aqueous-based separations for plutonium. Can you talk a little, Bob, about how some of these advanced recycling techniques, especially pyroprocessing, because that obviously has a lot of potential here, has an economic differentiation from sort of the big aqueous side? Meaning, how is it simpler? How can it be effectively cheaper and smaller? Just kind of at a high level based on how the process actually works and what the end products really need to be.
Yeah, so one of the aspects that's key, and again, I'm going to go back a little bit on history just because it's important to understand some of the drivers for what you're doing with the electrochemical processing, is one of the other benefits, and it's very much a benefit for what you're talking about, Jake, is you can turn around the fuel much faster. For the aqueous processing like it's currently being done in France and in Russia, you need long cooling times after the reactor before you're able to process the material, and then you're able to get it back into the reactor system. So one of the issues and one of the key achievements from the EBR2 processing was 2-month turnaround. It came out of the reactor, and 2 months later, the fuel pins were going back into the reactor. These are some of the things you can do with the fuels that are amenable to remote fabrication, which is with the metal alloy fuel, you can do remote fabrication much more simply than you can with traditional fuels, and the ability then to not have to be able to handle the heat within the processing itself, and to handle the radiation field and the heat. They have issues with aqueous processing, both on breakdown of some of the chemicals and handling the heat, which is why they have those cooling times before they do the processing of the fuel. So one of the benefits of going to the electrochemical processing is shorter turnaround times, which means a much smaller inventory of fuel that you need around outside the reactor when you're running the reactors. The other aspect, which in some studies has been viewed as a penalty for the electrochemical processing, but in others as a benefit, is it's typically a batch process. It's much more limited by the size of what you're going to put together and some of the criticality limits for that than it is for aqueous processing, where you dilute everything on the front end before you go into the system and into the processing. So you do things in batches. What this does give you, though, is it gives you equipment that's designed to do it on a small scale. And we've seen the same thing in reactors today, where people are looking at small modular reactors and the ability to replicate these small systems as opposed to going to large systems. So what this also gives you is the ability to scale a facility to a small number of reactors. The plant in France is dealing with their whole country's worth of reactors and processing the fuel from that. And in Russia also, they've got one big plant that's dealing with all the reactors. So you can site the small processing facilities near the reactors. And that really was, if you go back to the integral fast reactor idea, that was integral. Integral was the processing is located at the reactor site. That both gives you short turnaround, which was the first advantage, and it gives you not needing to transport the material around. So you don't have any of the transport of the spent fuel anymore. So those are some of the benefits, is rapid turnaround and smaller facilities so they can be co-located with the reactor and avoid any issues with transportation of spent fuel or fresh fuel back to the reactor sites.
So one question that kind of I think builds, in terms of how this plays out and how, as we think about things, is what does the waste form then look like? Because there's still a waste form. So what does that start to look like as you move to this system? In other words, how does that start to differentiate in a system like this compared to waste forms of I would say traditional today's reactors, and then also kind of more granularly. The other neat thing is not only can you use waste from today's reactors, you can obviously, just like you've described, use the output stream, used fuel of fast reactors. How does that process change? So in other words, if you're using the fuel if you're recovering the transuranics, recycling fuel in today's kind of used fuel from today's reactors, how does that compare then to how actually it looks to effectively recycle the used fuel from fast reactors? So, I guess I'm kind of asking too many questions at once, but what does it look like if you're taking, how does the waste change in this process? And then we can talk about the different fuel form considerations.
Right. So This was looked at a lot in the previous program, the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership, which went by the acronym GNEP. There are a lot of possible benefits for waste management once you're doing some processing of the fuel. It gives you the opportunity to put the fuel into the waste forms you want it to be. If you're going to direct dispose spent fuel, it's going to be in whatever your fuel form was, and it's going to be something like that configuration. Whereas when you're doing this and you're recovering the actinides, it gives you the chance to put the fission products into tailored waste forms, and those tailored waste forms will have better performance in the waste disposal environment. You still need to dispose of them. You still have fission products, and the more energy you produce, the more fission products you have, but you have the ability to put them into tailored waste forms when you're doing this processing. Now, what makes the question a little bit hard to answer, Jake, is the tailored waste forms will depend on the repository environment. And there are lots of debates out there because people are thinking different repository environments, and what you want to do depends on where you're going to dispose of it.
This is a pretty important capability though, because now you can match it to be flexible, right, of repository environments. So I guess that means you can save costs in that side significantly, potentially.
Yes. The other thing that we ran into, and we did a lot of work looking at for Yucca Mountain. So Yucca Mountain repository environment and many other repository environments are very dependent on the long-term heat within the repository environment. And there are some repository environments where that doesn't matter, but the majority of repository environments, there is some issue with the long-term heat. And this is a definite benefit when you're recycling the actinides, because the actinides are the source of the long-term heat. So you've removed that long-term heat, and you can either take advantage of that by some simplifications in the disposal of the material, or you can take advantage of that by higher loadings within the repository system because you've removed the heat source that was limiting the loading. And so in GNEP, we had a lot of work on that, on how much more material you could get, how much more energy from a related material you could get in there compared to going with direct disposal options.
So then, kind of going on that, is, you know, if we build fast reactors, which I think a lot of people are working to do, and I feel confident we're going to be seeing happen in greater and greater scales of variety types, well, how does the change then look like once you start taking in the used fuel from fast reactors into this process? Does it become simpler? Does it become more difficult than it is to use existing light water fuel? In other words, how do the economics compare?
Yeah, and that's, again, some of the benefits are what I was talking about for the waste disposal, about getting the actinides out of the stream, but you're going to have to be able to have a mechanism to capture that, which is difficult today, and how the waste system is set up. So,
well, but you know, as we think about comparing though, like just even the process of recycling LWR fuel versus recycling fast reactor fuel, how do those compare?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question, Jake.
Yeah.
So for LWR fuel, it only has about 1 or 1.5% fissile when it's discharged left, and you've really depleted the fissile content. So you have to go through 100 actinide atoms that you've reprocessed to recover 1.5, which are the material you're really trying to recover out of that. Conversely, fast reactor spent fuels are typically much higher assay in the fissile content. They may have 15 to 20% fissile in them. So you're getting a lot more useful material that you're recovering when you're reprocessing the fast reactor fuel than you are for the light water reactor fuel. And how this comes out in the studies is you'll see, for a given amount of material that you want to produce in useful fuel, you have to go to much higher mass flow rates when it's LWR fuel compared to when it's fast reactor fuel. So you can go to a very limited mass flow rate for fast reactor fuel and recover enough material to be able to use and to make recycled fuel material out of it.
I think that's one of the interesting aspects that then kind of bridges into you know, kind of a piece where you see this whole picture coming together, that you have pretty favorable economic approaches, both in terms of sourcing fresh fuel from the LWR side. If that's economic, obviously it's going to be even more economically attractive doing it from recovering it from the fast reactor fuel side. Right. So one question that kind of derives from that is, obviously we talk a lot about sort of this process of having the, you know, reactors that are coupled in with effectively recycling facilities. Focus more on the solid fuel side. What about some of the aspects about how we can tie this in with liquid fuel systems? In other words, we talked about breed and burn. We talked about kind of this closed full recycle. Now let's talk about some of the other neat things that fast reactors can do. Because right, we can use sodium, you can use lead, you can use gas, you can use salt. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can do it. You can do solid fuel, you can use liquid fuel. So it'd be interesting to talk about a little bit about that and kind of how that can play in terms of what you can do with a system that effectively operates with a liquid fuel form, and some of the things how that can sort of draw from the experiences and what we've developed to date already in terms of technological understandings in the space.
Right, so let me go to some of the pros and cons for liquid fuel forms. So from a fast reactor perspective, one of the big pros is you don't typically have these radiation damage limits that you have for solid fuels. For solid fuel, we really in fast reactors have to take it out of the reactor because we've hit a damage limit on the structural materials. Then you have to reconstitute it into a new solid fuel form and put it back in the reactor. For a liquid fuel, you're typically not going to have those limits. Eventually, you're going to build up enough fission products that it might be an issue, but you don't typically have those limits. And as far as the recycle of the material within a liquid fuel system, there's a variety of concepts out there. There are some concepts out there that are talking about doing this while the reactor's running. So actually within the reactor system, they have a separation system, and this would be some adaptation of the reprocessing technology that while the reactor's running, you pull off some of the stream and you get some of the fission products out, and you leave basically the actinides within the system. And then there are other liquid fuel concepts in a fast spectrum that are not doing that, but are just allowing the fission products to build up, and eventually they hit some limit on that, and then they have to shut it down, and they may process that bulk mass they have at the end. But so it's sort of the same concept we have with the solid fuel systems. You have the ones where they allow it to build up and other things limit it, which would be like the breed and burn solid fuel systems. And then you have the recycle ones, which would have the inline type of reprocessing within the fast spectrum systems. The differences on liquid fuel really come in on the reactor side. You are taking now your fission products and you're moving them throughout your heat transport system. So you have issues at the plant with you have your dose rate much more widely distributed than you do with a solid fuel form. And therefore you have also, issues if there's a leak, now it's a leak of the actual fuel material itself, not just of the coolant material like it is with a solid fuel case. So within the reactor system, it's a very different paradigm than what's been done in solid fuel systems. So there's a lot of issues on the licensing framework and things that need to be overcome there. And whether that balances out with the benefits or not from being able to do that, it will be seen. And there are companies working on those to try to overcome those challenges for the liquid fuel systems.
So one of the interesting things to me that you can think about with liquid fuel systems is obviously being able to kind of go straight into the fuel use, like you said, and be able to manage it from that side. I think one question that kind of naturally falls from that is there's a lot of innovation going on here, in terms of looking at how you couple in sort of this direct use, this in situ sort of isobreeding or breed and burn, as well as direct use of used fuel in the salt reactors. What about some of the other, we talked about pyro. What are some other approaches that are being looked at in terms of the R&D side that have potential for advanced recycling? Obviously, these ones are kind of the primary ones, but each reactor design might have different benefits in terms of what they're envisioning for fuel cycle. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those are that some folks may not have heard as much about?
I just saw the question pop up on fluoride volatility. That's one of the ones I've seen talked about for the different systems. Actually, there's probably a different reprocessing too within the solid fuel systems. Russia's looking at nitride fuels, and they would use something probably different than either the aqueous or the pyroprocessing that's being done in the US for theirs. I'm not the right expert, and I hope that'll come up in future ones for some of the ones for some of these other systems. But yes, typically for fast spectrum on the liquid fuels, you're looking at chloride molten salt concepts. So you have to have something that's going to work within that type of a system, and that may be very different than what they're looking at for the fluoride molten salt systems.
So kind of an interesting other question that sort of going back to how the separations process, the recycling plays out, and a question that often gets asked is, given what the streams look like, the product streams, given what's going on there, how do these technologies manage to sort of incorporate safeguard and securities by design to ensure effectively a strong non-proliferation standpoint and effectively stands in terms of how the technologies operate, especially with these what you can do with fast reactors, right? Because so much of it is about the fact that you can keep all of the actinides together. You don't need this high purity separated single stream of plutonium. You can keep it all sort of mucked up together, and it's still really useful fuel in a fast reactor. I'm kind of partially answering, but yeah.
No, but that's been for the U.S. technology development, Jake. That's been one of the guiding principles, is avoiding a pure plutonium stream and coming up with a recycling technology where you have that as something that you're avoiding within the system. And so you do have technologies for that. That's one of the key features with the electrochemical processing is it doesn't tend to do a very clean separation between the plutonium and the other transuranics in particular, and even some of the uranium you can have, and many operating modes go along with the plutonium. So we've developed a lot of technologies that can do that, and are looking at that. What was the rest of the question? I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. So
it was just about, how that process plays into having effectively a pretty safeguards and security kind of by design,
right.
Almost inherent safeguards and security almost is effective.
Right, and there has been a lot of work going on the research and development of the safeguards for the electrochemical processing technology. And it is very different than what you have for the aqueous processing. On the aqueous, you have a front end where you end up diluting everything, and everything after that point really becomes a measuring of those diluted streams. Within the electrochemical processing, again, it's more of a batch process, so it's more measuring the masses of material coming in and the masses of material coming out for smaller batches of material. So it's a very different type, but there has been a lot of research on that. Mark Williamson could talk, from Argonne, could talk a lot about the new sensors that have been developed to measure that even within the process at times, within the system. There's been a lot of good work on that. And again, one of the benefits that they've looked at for these systems that shouldn't be underestimated is the ability to do smaller scale processing at the reactor site. So for proliferation issues, you've contained, really, you're doing everything at the reactor site. You're not having to measure it between as it goes here and then when it goes elsewhere and then when it comes back. And that should really help with the safeguards of the material. Now, having said that, they have demonstrated they can do safeguards even with the Purex recycling. I don't think there's anybody who thinks the recycling they're doing in France is losing large amounts of fissile material that's being done elsewhere. They have developed, even for the pure plutonium reprocessing, the ability to show and safeguard that material and to verify that they are safeguarding that material. So even for those cases and those technologies, it has been done and it's being done today.
So one of the things that I think, stems out is, as you look at what you can do with that side of this, or what you can do with, fast reactors and closing the fuel cycle and dealing with the broad scalability of it, a question that comes up back is in the economics, which we heard a little bit about. We talked about one of the pieces here, that I think comes out is where and how do we approach basically doing fast reactors and realizing this vision. What is needed to entail that? One aspect I would add is that I think the wheels are in motion, in the sense that you see this renewed interest in advanced reactor development. We see federal programs, we see a surge of private investment, especially in fast reactor technologies, driving forward the broad potential they have, which isn't unique just to their fuel cycle benefits. That's a complementary and I'd say adding feature. But really the raw economics of power that can come from these systems. A question was asked about what is the general cost targets? And I think most fast reactor developers are looking at, hey, how do you build these technologies that ultimately have a pathway to producing power at grid competitive prices, right, or better? And I think it goes back to a comment I said earlier, which is when you look at, a term I've used in the past, cost physics, the things that drive the physics or drive the costs of reactor systems. There's a lot of favorable things you can do with a fast reactor and generally in advanced reactors as a whole that can drive you to be cost competitive with almost everything out there. So I think that's what's so exciting about what's going on here. And it lends itself to seeing if we see this broad scalability, like you said, Bob, that recycling piece becomes really important. One, for resource efficiency, that's really true, but also just for economics. Again, I think it's hard to understate, but as we're looking at a report that came from Argonne that identifies cost estimates for a pyro processing pilot facility, you can make fuel from that more cheaply than procuring fresh fuel. That's a pretty compelling case that all of a sudden you're going to be driving this in a different manner. So I'd ask the question, Bob, is what's going on right now in terms of things? I mean, obviously, a lot of this has been demonstrated in different ways. It's understood the physics are sound. Are there some of these advanced recycling techniques being run in different parts? You just talked about French and using aqueous reprocessing. What about pyro? Can you talk a little bit about what Argonne and Idaho have done or are doing even now in terms of some of their versions of that?
Yeah, so there's been, again, a lot of research and development and done up to the level of bench scale showing much more efficient pyroprocessing technology. And that's been done. It's been done mainly at the research level. Hasn't been done at the commercial scale as they've done Purex in France and in Russia and in Japan, actually. But I think on the reactor side too, there's a lot of work that's being done to get the costs down. And I think one of the early questions in here, was, oh, well, Rickover dismissed liquid metal technology because it was too expensive. And things have changed today. I mean, a lot of the issue there for the Navy was, they were used to water reactor technology and they knew how to run it and they were able to run it. And today we're in a different place with liquid metal technology. The Russian BN 600 reactor has operated for 30 years at a 70% plus capacity factor. This is not a technology that you can't run reliably for long periods of time. And they've run the last 20 years of that 30-year period with no sodium leaks. So they've also made big progress on that and some of the issues for the maintainability of it. So you really got to look at where the technology is today and what some of the benefits are. But a lot of the work in recent years, that's why I'm excited about the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, to start to get some demonstrations, because a lot of it's been research work and done at the pilot scale within the laboratories, and it needs to be demonstrated and shown that it can work. And one question I had for you, Jake, from either Oklo's perspective or some of the other Fast Reactor Working Groups, are there some economic targets that you're looking for as far as the power production rate? And I know that depends on what the niche is, whether you're going to do it here, as a large scale thing, or whether you're going to do it for some of the small reactors. But are there particular targets that are being pursued, or is it just a general get the costs down and we'll try to make it competitive?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think the answer is it's to be as competitive as possible. And I think in general, everyone's working to be cheaper than what the alternatives are across the grid. The approach taken is very different by each company. And I think that's one of the cool things about this is you see a variety of business models being employed here, but I think, some people are taking kind of the Tesla-esque model that, in sense of starting with a product aimed at a certain market that can then scale into other markets that can ultimately scale to be, mass produced at different economics, or at least when I say mass produced, it doesn't have to be because they're small, but just product development that gets you from early units that are more expensive to later units that are much cheaper, and maybe change in size. Others are going right off the bat with some systems that they intend to be able to hit, the cost targets that are grid competitive. And what I mean by grid competitive is not, more expensive. I mean, as expensive, basically the same cost or less than what's prevailing in market rates today. And that sounds bold, that sounds ambitious, but that's where we as an entire reactor industry have to be aiming for. I think that's one of the neat things too, is that there's a number of ways you can actually realize that. I think a lot of different reactor types have that potential. And I think fast reactors are very well suited, given different flavors, whether that be solid fuel with sodium or lead or gas or liquid fuel systems, all have an interesting angle of attack that's very viable, I think, to hit those economic targets. So personally, that's what's exciting about what the economic outlook looks like. And I think one of the key drivers is one thing you can do with fast reactors, you can change the cost paradigm, not just fast reactors, advanced reactors as a whole, about how the capital cost can drop. That might though lead to the fuel costs being relatively higher compared to capital costs than they are for example, today's reactors. But if you drop the capital cost further, and that can help drive that process to be pretty efficient. The thing that comes out of that though is if you can then use fast reactors to handle a fuel product that then is actually cheaper than using kind of a fresh HALEU baseline or fresh uranium or enriched uranium baseline cost, which is what you can do with fast reactors. Now all of a sudden you can get those cost numbers down further, and all of a sudden you see this mutual benefit, or this cross-cutting benefit of reduction in capital, reduction in fuel. You're in a really good place to be competitive. So I would say that the target number ranges from different applications, but I think it's safe to say people are looking at how do we produce power for less than, if not significantly less than 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And then with then granularity scaling across different unique market considerations and regional and local aspects of it. I can say that that can't happen soon enough as I sit in California and look at it about an average price right now of 35 cents a kilowatt hour. Thankfully, no power blackouts, but clearly grid competitive here would, would be different. So, you know, the aspects of nuclear developing in California is a separate conversation, but I do think that one of the cool things you can do with fast reactors is deal with a major concern that exists in places like California, which is waste. So, you know, I think the fact that you can change that narrative starts to change that whole game. So at the end of the day, if you're driving towards cheap electricity, the market wins, nuclear does that. But then you can capture these different externalities, no carbon, big win. And then for fast reactors, you change the waste story. So I think a question that's somewhat provocative, but I think it's a good one to have is, how does that compare? I mean, you know, I've seen consulting studies that talk about the real cost of waste disposal is different effectively than what's been, I think, allocated out. What is one of the neat things about how fast reactors can actually fully capture their actual true waste management and disposal costs? Is that something, Bob, that's really enabled, do you think, by these advanced recycling techniques and how that can actually work?
I think it is, and I think just like you see a lot of movement towards SMRs in the current market, and the ability to demonstrate these things smaller first and then replicate it and do large. I think that's an important thing also on some of the fuel cycle benefits, because if you have to build a huge plant like what the French have before you're going to know what the economics are and if you're going to be able to run it, it's going to be a very hard situation. It's going to be a very high hurdle to get over. Whereas what we looked at in the pyroprocessing, the small scaled facility, it was looking at the harder concept, because we were looking at LWR spent fuel, not fast reactor spent fuel, but doing it at a small scale. And I think just like for the advanced reactor concepts, doing these things at a small scale and demonstrating them is important, not just because you have the technology, but also to start to change the paradigm of how they're going to be introduced into the market. Because that's a big issue for SMRs, because the first ones are going to cost a lot more per unit than the later ones. So how do you get this done correctly? And with the waste side, you know, we know it's expensive, and we know it's, you know, there's all these political issues too with dealing with the direct disposal path. Is there a way to start to change the whole paradigm and to move it into a different argument? That would be helped a lot by having some small scale demonstrations, in my opinion.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's a pretty exciting horizon that looks ahead, which, you know, I think as you think about the future, there's such it's a bright time for nuclear. There's obviously challenges, but what we're looking at with these advanced technologies and the things you can do by really tapping into fission's potential, we really just, I think, scratched the tip of the iceberg in the last, you know, 70 years. So what are some of the things you're most excited about looking forward, Bob, in terms of, as you look at the horizon, having spent your career helping advance the state of the art for fast reactors for this time, what do you look forward to in the next 10 to 20 years in terms of fast reactor development, as well as just overall nuclear technology development?
Right. The big thing I look forward to is some demonstrations, Jake. So I really think that we've lost some of the ability. When I started my career, EBR2 was up and running, and we were doing fuels testing in EBR2. And I can tell you, you did the fuels tests, and you learned both the good and the bad things from the fuels test, and the next fuels test performed better, and the reactors performed better. So I think there's a whole set of lessons here that are going to be learned in the advanced reactor space as things are demonstrated and as you're actually up and running the systems that, you know, you don't get from paper studies. Paper studies are useful and they help guide you to what's important, but, you know, you need to actually have the experience and demonstrate them. And I learned a lot in my career talking to the operators who ran EBR2 and ran these reactors, and we need that type of learning and that type of knowledge within the community in order to get not just beyond the good ideas, but to find ways to implement those good ideas into workable systems. So I think the test reactor is a good option there too. Again, it's just going to give the option to test and to really see, and then you'll get some refinements and some benefits as you move forward in the future. So, but I'm excited to see the interest. I mean, there was a time in my career in the late 90s where there were not many companies interested in advanced reactor technology, and even the US government at times thought that US nuclear was going to disappear within the next few decades. And so it's very exciting to see the interest, because there are benefits that can be had there. And if we're going to need nuclear, and I agree that we need it for clean energy, then these are very important to take advantage of these benefits and have a broad spectrum of options, not just one or two reactor types that can be utilized.
Yeah, I think that's what's so cool, is there is this natural ecosystem that's in its infancy, and you see the levels of support coming in from multiple different aspects of whether that be policymakers in a bipartisan manner, whether that be folks who are advocating for clean energy that includes nuclear, to the developers pursuing a diversity of approaches that are not just technologically based, but business model based, operational model based, which all of a sudden creates such an array of product offerings as we look forward, that you see that nuclear can meet, I think we'll be in a place where it can meet almost any imaginable need for energy in some way, either directly or indirectly through its ability to make copious amounts of clean energy that can go out on its grid. And I think one of the things that people have asked about is, what do we need to do to make these things happen? That there's a vision that's been painted and described very eloquently and articulately by many folks leading up, obviously, to now too. And what we tried to capture in this webinar is what needs to be done, what can happen here. I think there's a couple things that really drive that. One is obviously continued R&D support is really important at the policy level. We need to make sure people recognize the importance of continuing to invest in the fundamental research and development that keeps the pipeline full from concept initialization, that's very early in its development, all the way through development to demonstration and into deployment. And so in other words, if we can get and make sure we treat nuclear like a source of energy that it is, which is very clean and extremely scalable and sustainable, it should get on the same effective level of support on the deployment side that you've seen for other clean energy technologies that have proven really effective in driving those costs down by creating that strong market pull. Look at how solar and wind costs have developed. I think you can see the same things happen with nuclear. And we need to articulate the importance of that to policymakers to help create those frameworks. The other thing is helping articulate that this is an important solution opportunity. In other words, what fast reactors can do, how they can actually recycle that, articulating that, or recycle fuel, close the fuel cycle, even help address existing inventories of used fuel and the waste management aspects in a much more streamlined and economically efficient way. I think those things alone just help make awareness drive decision-making to incorporate nuclear broadly. I think economics are going to push us into this road anyway. The question is how quickly we get there. And I think that's where people advocating to the representatives, to the senators about the importance of these things really actually makes a difference. It's incredibly valuable when even a single congressperson or senator hears a letter from a constituent saying, nuclear is really important. I'm really excited about what advanced reactors can do, especially what fast reactors can do in these spaces. You got to keep supporting it. That alone creates the field to be open, to be able to support things that accelerate these things occurring. And I think the other exciting part that's going on here is we talk a lot about federal level aspects. One thing that we're starting to see is, if you look at it, talk more about broadly as an industry, is what's happening on the private investment side. Nuclear is becoming increasingly investable in terms of new technology development and ultimately deployment. We see more capital than ever before flowing from private entities into nuclear companies. We see a whole new wave of the startup model that's worked so well in software technology being validated in technology space, for hard technology space, like look at Tesla, look at SpaceX, seeing that model now apply over into nuclear. We're just in the early days of that. And that's so promising because that's where you start to unlock really significant cost savings and benefit models. There's a good report that came out that talked about something on the order of $1.5 billion in private capital going to nuclear companies. That's awesome. And that's only going to grow. So, the more we can create the right environment for that to happen and those things, it really drives it. I think the other part that gets into support is being, as this plays out, the regulator, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, plays an important role in ensuring and enabling the safe use of nuclear power. But that key part still needs to be reminded to them, which is the role of enabling. They're one of the most important agencies when it comes to climate change that there is, in terms of enabling the deployment of clean technology. They need to understand that role more acutely and clearly in Congress, basically, and the Senate, and effectively the oversight of those groups, spurred by their constituents, by us, need to help them realize the importance that they have in their role in making sure that things can be done efficiently and effectively, so we can more quickly realize these visions we're describing here. So I appreciate, Bob, you joining me today. I'm pretty excited about what the future has. I think what we see, going on, this was a good chance to talk about some of the high-level aspects and some of the dive into the weeds in some areas, and it's just the first of several conversations we're going to have, and bringing in other participants as well.
Can I
And
remark on
we're pretty
one
excited
more
about it.
item?
Yeah, I was gonna just turn it over to you, Bob. So I was gonna say actually on that, yeah, Bob, if you wanna add a couple comments before we close it out.
Yeah,
So
one more item, Jake, with relation to fuel
yeah,
cycle. I agree, and I'm very excited to see lots of companies interested, and I very much hope that you're right on what the future is and that things are moving in that direction. One aspect that we didn't talk about is the international aspect here on the fuel cycle. And fuel cycles
yeah,
today are not just domestic; they're international. And one of the concerns I have is you see a lot of interest from the U.S. on wanting to be influential on fuel cycles and wanting to have fuel cycles that have great safeguards and can be implemented without concerns and can be done worldwide. And the best way to do that is to have an option and to have a demonstrated option and have a technology out there. And that's, I think, one of the biggest concerns I have, because they're going to build nuclear around the world. They're going to have fuel cycles. And if we don't have options from the United States, they're going to get it from Russia or India or China.
yeah, I completely agree. And I think it also is an important tool to have. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's an important tool to have in our disposal as well, as we want to be competitive on a global stage. And the more we can offer a solution where we bring reactors to countries who are interested in it, we can do that in a competitive manner, and then we can take the materials back. That's what that helps us become, I think, the global leader really in this field again, in terms of exporting reactors. And one great way to ensure that is that, hey, we can take that material back and find other uses and reuse it. And, that makes it, I think, even more attractive. And so you're right, like doing it internally, other countries are already doing these things. We need to do that ourselves, and we need to be back in the leadership position on that, for a number of reasons. And it also just helps our ability to export a product that drives ultimately American jobs and American growth, while also deploying clean energy and helping leapfrog the fossil fuel transition on a global scale. So I think it's a great point. I appreciate you brought that up. Bob, do you have any other kind of closing comments or remarks?
No other closing comments, Jake. I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity and state that I'm looking forward to some of the broader Fast Reactor Working Group upcoming webinars and hearing about the different technologies, and especially hearing about the interest from the companies and why they're pursuing that technology and some of the benefits they see. So I'm looking forward to the future webinars.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob, and thanks again for joining us on this one. As we look at these webinars, we've got several more coming up. So you'll see those announced, but the next one on deck is going to be one talking about different fast reactor technologies. So you'll be hearing from the developers who are looking at the different ways you can actually design and run fast reactors. So ranging from the different combinations of coolants and fuel options, that'll be a pretty exciting one. So we'll be joined by representatives kind of spanning the major technology categories there. And then we'll be continuing actually from this conversation in the following webinars after that dive into more details that we got to touch on today. So for example, diving into the opportunities that are sort of focused on what you can do with fast reactor technologies in a, I would say, slightly different manner than what we've thought about, or to a very wholly different manner than what we've looked at historically in the past. So talking about some of the work going on in molten salts, as well as some of the other advanced recycling techniques. And then also a webinar focused on the progress and development and experience with pyroprocessing and where that technology stands and what that has in store for its ability to help address this, but also on its kind of outlook for being able to actually be economically viable, just on the ability to provide fuel, much less its other economic benefits. So we're going to have a lot of these coming down the road. We appreciate everyone who joined us on this one. As usual, these will be posted on YouTube. So keep your eye out for it, and then you'll be looking for the next webinar announcements coming up after that. So thanks to everyone who joined. Thanks, Bob, so much for participating today and adding your expertise and your commentary. As usual, folks have questions. We try to answer these as they come in, and also ones we don't